Thomas Mitchell loved his little piece of heaven. For over 15 years, he'd lived on the 5-acre property that had been in his family for generations. The land wasn't fancy, but it had character: rolling hills dotted with old oak trees, a small stream that babbled year-round, and a natural pond that reflected the sky like a mirror. This was where Thomas found peace after a long day's work. Every morning, he'd sit on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching ducks land on the water and deer come to drink at dawn. The property line ran right through the eastern edge of the pond, but that had never been a problem before. The neighboring land had always been empty fields. That all changed 3 years ago when bulldozers rolled in and started clearing those fields. Within months, the empty space transformed into Whispering Pines, an upscale housing development with identical 2-story homes, perfectly trimmed lawns, and streets named after trees that had been cut down to build it. Thomas tried to be a good neighbor. He waved at the new families moving in, kept his property tidy, and minded his own business. For a while, things were okay. The development had a small homeowners association that mostly handled community picnics and lawn care rules. But last spring, everything changed when Valerie Harrington moved into the biggest house in Whispering Pines. Within 2 months, she'd gotten herself elected as HOA president. Folks in town called her the bulldozer because she steamrolled over anyone who disagreed with her. Thomas first met Valerie on a warm Tuesday afternoon when he found her standing at his pond, taking pictures with her phone. She wore pressed khaki pants, a polo shirt with the HOA logo, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her pinched face. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, walking over with his old border collie, Blue, trailing behind him. Valerie jumped, then composed herself. "Oh, you must be Mr. Mitchell. I'm Valerie Harrington, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." She stuck out her hand like she was doing him a favor by touching him. Thomas shook it briefly. "You're on my property, Miss Harrington." "Well, that's actually why I'm here." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "There seems to be some confusion about the property lines. According to our development maps, this pond is partially on common ground." Thomas had to laugh. "Ma'am, my family's owned this land since 1978. The survey lines are clear as day." Valerie's smile tightened. "Perhaps your information is outdated." How developers use the latest GPS technology for their surveys. That was the beginning of the trouble. Over the next few weeks, official-looking letters started appearing in Thomas's mailbox, all bearing the Whispering Pines logo. Each one claimed slightly more of his land belonged to them. When Thomas ignored the letters, Valerie escalated. She'd park her shiny SUV at the edge of his driveway and walk the property line with a measuring wheel, making notes and taking more pictures. Sometimes she'd bring along other HOA board members, pointing at his pond and gesturing wildly. "They're planning something," Thomas told his daughter Jenny during their weekly phone call. "That woman's got her eye on my pond, and I don't like it one bit." Jenny sighed through the phone. "Dad, maybe you should talk to a lawyer, just in case." "Waste of money," Thomas grumbled. "I've got all the original deeds and surveys in my filing cabinet. Clear as day where my land ends." He thought his paperwork would be enough to keep Valerie and her HOA friends at bay. But one evening as the sun was setting, Thomas spotted Valerie leading a man in a suit around his pond. The man carried a tablet and nodded as she pointed at different areas. Blue growled low in his throat, and Thomas felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Whatever Valerie was planning, it wasn't going to be good. But even in his worst nightmares, he couldn't have imagined what he'd find when he returned from his fishing trip the following Monday. The boundary dispute was just the beginning. The real trouble was about to start. Thomas spent the weekend at Lake Crawford with his fishing buddy Bill. For 2 glorious days, they caught bass, told stories, and forgot about everyday troubles. Thomas didn't mention Valerie or her boundary walking antics. Out on the water, those problems seemed small and far away. Monday morning, Thomas drove home with a cooler of fish and a slightly sunburned nose. He turned onto his gravel driveway, the tires crunching rhythmically as his little white farmhouse came into view. Something felt off, but he couldn't place it at first. Then he heard it, the rumble of heavy machinery. Thomas parked his truck and let Blue out of the passenger side. The old dog's ears perked up, and he took off running toward the pond. Thomas followed, his fishing hat still on his head, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft ground. What he saw made his heart sink to his stomach. 3 yellow excavators were digging up the eastern edge of his pond. A cement truck idled nearby, its drum slowly turning. Men in orange vests and hard hats moved around like ants, measuring, marking, and shouting to each other. They'd already cleared trees and flattened a large patch of land, his land. "Hey!" Thomas shouted, waving his arms. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" A man in a white hard hat looked up from his clipboard. He had a thick mustache and tired eyes. "Morning. You the property owner?" "Yes, I'm Thomas Mitchell, and you're trespassing," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. The foreman, Bob, according to his vest, sighed like he'd been expecting this. He pulled a folded paper from his back pocket and handed it to Thomas. "Work order for a community water management facility," Bob explained. "All signed and approved by the Whispering Pines HOA president." Thomas unfolded the paper with trembling hands. There it was, Valerie Harrington's elaborate signature authorizing construction on what she claimed was HOA property. The paper included a small map showing the pond fully within the development's boundaries. "This is wrong," Thomas said, his voice rising. "This is my land. I've got surveys, deeds, everything. You can't just start building here." Bob rubbed his neck uncomfortably. "Look, mister, I'm just doing the job I was hired for. The lady who hired us said all permits were in order, said the county signed off on everything." Thomas pulled out his phone. "We'll see about that." He called the county office, pacing back and forth as the machinery continued its work. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached someone in the permits department. "Mitchell property on Old Creek Road," the clerk confirmed after checking their records. "Yes, we have a recent permit filing for construction. Let me see. Yes, it was approved last Wednesday." "That's impossible," Thomas sputtered. "I never approved anything." The application came with property boundary documentation showing the construction site on Whispering Pines HOA land, the clerk explained. "The paperwork looks in order from our end." Thomas felt his blood pressure rising. She falsified documents. The boundary isn't where she claims. While still on the phone, Thomas watched in horror as workers poured the first section of concrete foundation. By the time he convinced the clerk to investigate further and issue a temporary stop work order, significant damage was already done. A large flatbed truck turned into his driveway, carrying prefabricated metal walls. Thomas stood in its path, forcing it to stop. "You can't unload that here," he said firmly. "Construction is halted pending a county investigation." The driver looked confused. "I've got a delivery schedule, man. These panels need to be installed today." "Not happening," Thomas replied, standing his ground. An hour later, Valerie's silver SUV came roaring up the driveway. She stepped out wearing heels that sank into the soft earth, her face twisted with annoyance. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice falsely sweet, "I see you're back from your trip. There seems to be some confusion." "The only confusion is how you think you can build on my property," Thomas replied. Valerie's smile vanished. The property lines were resurveyed. "This area belongs to the community now." "That's a lie, and you know it," Thomas said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "Do you know how much this project costs? The HOA has already invested thousands. If you obstruct necessary community infrastructure, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Thomas looked at the mess they'd made of his peaceful pond shore, the concrete already setting in the earth. "Bring your lawyers," he said. "This isn't over." What Thomas didn't know then was just how nasty things were about to get. Thomas sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, old deeds, property surveys, tax records, and the stop work order he'd finally secured from the county. His daughter Jenny had driven over as soon as he called her about the construction mess. "Dad, you need a lawyer," Jenny said, pouring them both another cup of coffee. "This isn't something you can fight on your own." Thomas ran his hand through his gray hair. "Lawyers cost money, Jenny. Money I don't have just lying around." "What choice do we have?" "That woman falsified documents. She's stealing your land." The next morning, they drove to the small law office in town. The sign on the door read, "Elena Vasquez, Attorney at Law." Inside, the office was small but neat, with diplomas on the wall and a bookshelf full of thick legal volumes. Elena was younger than Thomas expected, maybe in her early 40s, with reading glasses perched on top of her head and a no-nonsense handshake. "Property disputes are my specialty," she said after hearing their story. "But I won't sugarcoat this, Mr. Mitchell. Cases like these can get complicated." "I just want them off my land," Thomas said. "I have all the paperwork right here." Elena looked through his documents, nodding occasionally. "These are good. Your boundary lines are clearly established." She pulled out a notepad. "I'll file for an emergency injunction today. That should keep them from doing any more construction until we sort this out." For a few days, Thomas felt hopeful. The construction stopped while the county investigated the permit discrepancies. Blue seemed happier too, no longer growling at the sound of machinery. Then came the certified letter from Harrington, Peck and Associates, legal representatives of Whispering Pines HOA. Inside was a bombshell. Valerie claimed that the HOA had purchased water rights to the pond 5 years ago from Thomas's uncle Richard. There was even a document with what looked like his uncle's signature. "This is complete nonsense," Thomas told Elena over the phone. "My uncle never sold anything. He loved this place. Besides, he passed away 7 years ago, not 5. "They're grasping at straws," Elena reassured him. "But this complicates things. They're trying to tie us up in legal knots." While the lawyers babbled it out with motions and counter-motions, Valerie launched a different kind of attack. Flyers appeared in all the mailboxes in Whispering Pines. "Urgent to community NOTIC. Water supply threatened by uncooperative neighbor." The flyer painted Thomas as a selfish old man refusing to allow necessary infrastructure for the neighborhood's water supply. It claimed water bills would triple without the new facility. At the bottom was a notice for an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the Mitchell situation. Thomas decided to attend this meeting. He put on his best shirt and drove to the Whispering Pines Community Center. But when he tried to enter, a young man with a clipboard stopped him. "HOA members only," he said without looking up. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. They're discussing my property in there. I have a right to speak." The man finally looked at him, recognition dawning on his face. I need to check with the board president." He disappeared inside, returning minutes later with Valerie herself. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with a tight smile, "this is a private meeting for homeowners only. I'm afraid I can't let you in." "You're talking about my land in there," Thomas insisted. "You're spreading lies about me." Several residents had stopped to watch. Valerie raised her voice slightly, ensuring they could all hear. "Nobody is spreading lies, Mr. Mitchell. We're simply discussing the community's water needs, which you seem determined to block for personal reasons." An older woman Thomas didn't know spoke up from the doorway. "Is it true our water bills will go up because of him?" Valerie nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, yes. Without access to the local water source, we'll have to pipe it in from the county system at considerable expense." More residents gathered, whispering and staring at Thomas. He felt like he'd stumbled into a trap. "These people are being fed lies," Thomas told Elena the next day. "Valerie's turning the whole neighborhood against me." Elena sighed. "It's a tactic. They're hoping public pressure will make you give in." "It won't," Thomas said firmly. "This is my home. I won't be bullied off it." What he didn't know was how expensive standing his ground would turn out to be. 6 months. That's how long Thomas fought in court before his bank account couldn't take it anymore. Each month, the legal bills piled higher while Valerie's team found new ways to drag out the case. They'd filed motion after motion, requested extension after extension, and buried Elena in paperwork. Thomas sat at his kitchen table staring at the latest bill from Elena's office. The amount due was more than his monthly pension. Blue rested his graying muzzle on Thomas's knee, as if sensing his owner's distress. "What am I supposed to do now, boy?" Thomas asked, scratching behind Blue's ears. The phone rang. It was Elena. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," she said, her voice tired. "But Judge Wilson denied our latest motion. Valerie's lawyers convinced him that continuing to block the water plant construction poses a significant public health concern for Whispering Pines residents." Thomas closed his eyes. "What does that mean for us?" "It means the temporary work stoppage is lifted. They can resume construction while the case proceeds. But it's my land, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know. And we have good arguments. But Thomas, Elena paused. Cases like this can drag on for years. Their strategy is to outlast you financially. After a long silence, Thomas asked the question he'd been avoiding. What happens if we settle? 2 weeks later, Thomas sat across from Valerie in a conference room downtown. Their lawyers flanked them like seconds in a duel. The settlement agreement lay on the table between them. Elena had negotiated the best terms she could. The HOA would pay Thomas a monthly easement fee for the portion of the property they were using. The fee wasn't much, but it was something. The water plant would be allowed to remain operational, with some cosmetic requirements to make it less of an eyesore. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Mitchell? Valerie's lawyer asked. Thomas looked at the paper, then at Valerie. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes held a gleam of victory that made his stomach turn. Sign it, Thomas, Elena whispered. It's the best we can do. His hand felt heavy as he picked up the pen. Each letter of his name felt like a surrender. Valerie was all smiles and handshakes afterward, talking about community cooperation for the reporters she'd invited. Thomas slipped out the back door without comment. The construction resumed with a vengeance. Within weeks, the water plant was fully operational, a concrete box with metal pipes sticking out at odd angles, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. The constant hum of machinery replaced the natural sounds Thomas had loved. It's just ugly, Dad, Jenny said when she visited that weekend. They stood on the back porch, looking at where the pond had once been full and vibrant. Now it was half its original size, the water level noticeably lower as the plant pumped it out day and night. It's not just ugly, Thomas replied. Listen. The mechanical hum never stopped, day or night. It found its way into Thomas's dreams, waking him at odd hours. Worse than the noise were the maintenance workers. They showed up whenever they pleased, walking across Thomas's yard without so much as a nod. When he complained to the HOA, he received a letter referring him to Section 12.4 of the settlement agreement. Reasonable access for maintenance purposes shall be granted at all times. One Tuesday morning, Thomas found tire tracks through his vegetable garden. The tomato plants he tended all summer were crushed. He marched over to the water plant where 2 workers were checking gauges outside. You drove through my garden, he said, pointing to the obvious tire tracks. The younger worker shrugged. Sorry, man. We were told this was the access route. By who? HOA president. Said it was all in the agreement. That afternoon, Thomas stood in Valerie's front yard, settlement agreement in hand. Her house was the biggest in the development, 2 stories of pristine white siding with black shutters and a perfect lawn. When she opened the door, her smile vanished at the sight of him. The agreement says reasonable access, Thomas said, holding up the document. Driving through my garden isn't reasonable. Valerie leaned against her doorframe. Perhaps you should have read the fine print more carefully, Mr. Mitchell. The definition of reasonable is quite broad in legal terms. She started to close the door, then paused. Oh, and do be careful about confronting me at my home. That could be construed as harassment. The door closed in his face. Thomas stood there for a long moment, feeling older than his 68 years. He'd lost. His beautiful land was ruined, his peace shattered, his bank account drained. But sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, you find something unexpected. Fall came early that year. The trees around Thomas's property turned golden and red, and the mornings grew crisp. After the crushing defeat of the settlement, Thomas tried to pick up the pieces of his life. He fixed his garden, planted new tomatoes that wouldn't bear fruit until next year, and took Blue for long walks in the woods far from the water plant. One gusty October morning, a severe thunderstorm rolled through overnight. Thomas woke to find branches scattered across his yard. He put on his old work jacket, grabbed a pair of gloves, and headed out to clean up the mess. Blue trotted alongside him as he dragged branches to a pile near the shed. The dog suddenly perked up his ears and darted toward the water plant, barking at something. Blue, get back here, Thomas called, but the old dog kept going. Sighing, Thomas followed. The storm had knocked down part of the chain-link fence surrounding the water plant. Blue was sniffing at something near the concrete foundation. Come on, boy. "We don't want to get in trouble for trespassing," Thomas said with a bitter laugh at the irony. As he got closer, Thomas noticed something odd. The rain had washed away some of the soil near the foundation, revealing a large drainage pipe he'd never seen before. It wasn't connected to any of the visible systems above ground. Thomas knelt down, his knees protesting. The pipe was industrial-grade PVC, at least 2 feet in diameter. It extended from beneath the water plant and disappeared into the ground, heading straight across his property. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas whispered. He followed the direction of the pipe, noting how the ground dipped slightly along what must be its buried path. The trail led across his backyard, through a stand of pines, and toward the county drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of his property. This drainage system wasn't in any of the plans he'd seen. It wasn't mentioned in the settlement papers either. No easement had been granted for a drainage pipe. Thomas took pictures with his phone, marking the path with small flags he used for his garden. Then he called his old friend Phil, who had worked as a county water engineer before retirement. "Can you come take a look at something? I think our HOA friends cut some corners," Thomas said. Phil arrived an hour later in his rusty pickup. He had reading glasses perched on his nose and decades of experience in his eyes. "Well, that's not up to code," Phil said after examining the pipe. "They're using your property as their main drainage outlet without proper permits or easements. And look here." He pointed to where the pipe connected to the plant. They skimped on the proper flood controls. In heavy rain, this whole system would back up something fierce. Thomas felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "What happens if this drainage gets blocked?" he asked. Phil scratched his gray beard. "Without a proper outlet, the water's got to go somewhere. It would back up into their system, overflow their holding tanks. Water follows gravity. It would flow downhill toward the development." That evening, Thomas spread maps across his kitchen table. The original survey maps, topographical charts of the area, even flood zone documentation from the county. He'd been a civil engineer himself before retiring, and those skills were coming back to him now. He plotted the water plant's location, the path of the hidden drainage pipe, and the natural slope of the land. Then he looked up the elevation of each house in Whispering Pines using county records. An interesting pattern emerged. Most homes sat on slightly elevated lots, but one house, the biggest one with the perfect lawn and black shutters, sat at the lowest point in the development. Valerie's showplace home was directly downhill from the water plant. "That's interesting," Thomas murmured to himself. He called Phil again. If someone wanted to legally manage water flow on their own property, say, for erosion control, what permits would they need? "Standard soil conservation permit. Easy to get if you know what you're doing," Phil replied. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. "I think I remember how to fill out those forms." For the next few weeks, Thomas threw himself into research. He studied rainfall patterns in the area, calculated water flow rates, and documented the unauthorized drainage system with photographs and measurements. He wasn't planning revenge. He told himself he was simply asserting his property rights. During a visit to the county office, he bumped into an old classmate who now worked in the permits department. "Tom, haven't seen you in ages. What brings you in?" Thomas smiled. "Just looking to do some wetland restoration on my property. Got to take care of the land, you know." As he walked out with his approved permits, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The tide was about to turn. Thomas checked the weather forecast every morning that spring. He'd been waiting for the right conditions, and finally the local news delivered exactly what he needed. Heavy storms expected this weekend. Rainfall amounts could reach 3 to 4 inches. Possible flash flooding in low-lying areas. "It's time," he told Blue, who wagged his tail as if he understood. For 3 months, Thomas had worked steadily on his wetland restoration project. He'd hired a small excavation crew recommended by Phil. They came on a Tuesday when the water plant maintenance staff wasn't around. "Just follow the markings exactly," Thomas instructed the crew boss. "Everything's in the permits." The workers dug a series of channels and small holding ponds on Thomas's property, all carefully designed to redirect water flow. To anyone passing by, it looked like simple landscaping or erosion control. But Thomas had calculated every angle, every slope, and every capacity with surgical precision. Most importantly, they legally capped the unauthorized drainage pipe where it crossed his property. They didn't remove it. That might have been questionable legally, but they blocked it and redirected any water flow into Thomas's new system of channels. All finished, Mr. Mitchell, the crew boss, said, handing him the final paperwork. "Got your county inspector sign-off right here. Everything's up to code." Thomas nodded, tucking the papers safely into a waterproof folder where he kept all his permits and documentation. Everything had to be by the book. He couldn't afford another legal battle. The Friday of the forecasted storm, Thomas checked his preparations one last time. His new drainage system was working perfectly, the unauthorized pipe remained properly blocked, and all his documentation was in order. Around dusk, the sky turned an ominous gray-green. The wind picked up, bending the trees around his property. Thomas brought Blue inside and settled into his favorite chair on the enclosed porch where he could watch the storm roll in. The rain started slowly, fat, heavy drops that tapped on the roof. Within an hour, it had become a downpour. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the house. Blue hid under Thomas's chair, always nervous during storms. "It's okay, boy," Thomas said, reaching down to pet him. "Just nature doing its thing." By midnight, the storm was at full strength. Thomas pulled on a raincoat and rubber boots and stood on his covered back porch, watching the water flow through his newly constructed channels. The system was working exactly as designed. Water collected in the small retention ponds before flowing into the larger channels that led downhill, away from the blocked culvert and directly toward Whispering Pines. The water plant's floodlights glowed eerily through the rain. Thomas could see the emergency overflow starting to kick in as water backed up in their system. Without the drainage pipe across his property functioning, the plant's holding tanks were quickly reaching capacity. A siren started wailing from the plant, an automatic alarm warning of system overload. Thomas checked his watch. The night maintenance crew would be arriving soon to investigate, but there wasn't much they could do. The water had to go somewhere, and the only place it could go now was downhill. Thomas didn't stay outside to watch what happened next. He went back inside, made a cup of hot chocolate, and sat with Blue as the storm continued to rage. He had done everything legally. His permits were in order. His water management system was approved by the county. If the HOA's unauthorized drainage pipe could no longer handle their water plant's output, well, that wasn't his problem. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas heard emergency vehicles in the distance. Their sirens grew louder as they approached Whispering Pines. From his upstairs window, he could see flashing lights reflecting off the rainy darkness. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. This wasn't about joy or revenge. This was about justice and consequences. About powerful people learning they couldn't break the rules without eventually facing the results of their actions. He went to bed as the rain continued to fall, knowing that by morning, the landscape of his dispute with Valerie Harrington would be forever changed. And somewhere downhill, in the lowest point of Whispering Pines development, water was finding its natural path, right through Valerie's perfect home. Morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong, as if the storm had never happened. Thomas made his coffee and took it out to the porch. His property looked fine. His drainage channels had worked perfectly, directing water away from his home and garden. In the distance, he could hear the buzz of activity from Whispering Pines. Blue wanted his morning walk, so Thomas clipped on the leash and headed down his driveway. What he saw when he reached the main road made him stop in his tracks. 3 fire trucks were parked along the entrance to Whispering Pines. People in rain boots waded through ankle-deep water that still covered the lowest parts of the development. Residents stood in small groups on higher ground, pointing and talking in worried voices. Thomas didn't venture into the neighborhood. He didn't need to. He could see portable pumps working to clear water from the streets and emergency workers directing traffic around the worst flooding. He turned and headed back home, feeling strangely calm. What happened next would depend on Valerie. He didn't have to wait long. Just after lunch, a police cruiser pulled into his driveway. Officer Reynolds stepped out. Thomas knew him from high school, though they hadn't spoken in years. "Morning, Tom," the officer said without much enthusiasm. "Got a complaint from Valerie Harrington. Says you deliberately flooded her house." Thomas nodded toward his kitchen. "Want some coffee while we talk?" Inside, Thomas laid out his documentation on the table: original property surveys, the unauthorized drainage pipe photos, his legal permits for water management, and the county inspector's approval of his work. Officer Reynolds looked it all over quietly, occasionally nodding. So they'd built this pipe across your land without permission? Yes, it wasn't in any of the settlement documents either. And your water management system is all permitted and legal? Thomas nodded. Every inch of it. Officer Reynolds sighed, pushing back from the table. Well, I don't see anything criminal here, Tom. Looks like a civil matter to me. He stood up. I'll let Mrs. Harrington know she needs to take this up with her lawyers if she wants to pursue it. Thomas walked him to the door. Thanks for being fair about this. The officer paused. Between us, half the folks in town are sick of that woman and her HOA rules. My brother-in-law got fined because his grass was half an inch too tall. He shook his head. Still, you might want to brace yourself. She seemed pretty worked up. Right on cue, as Officer Reynolds was pulling away, Valerie's SUV came speeding up the driveway, mud splashed across its sides. She stormed out, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Her face was red with anger. You, she shouted, marching toward Thomas. You flooded my house. 6 inches of water on my first floor. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused? Thomas stood calmly on his porch. I managed water on my own property using legal permits approved by the county. If your water plant overflowed, that's because you built an unauthorized drainage system across my land without proper permits. I'll sue you for everything you have, she threatened, pointing a finger at his face. I don't think that would be wise, Thomas replied, opening a folder. I have documentation that the HOA built an illegal drainage pipe across my property without easements or permits. I have proof that you falsified boundary documents. I have photos of your maintenance crews trespassing outside the approved access paths. He looked her in the eye. How do you think the county inspector will react when he sees all this? Or the other homeowners when they learn their HOA president cut corners and caused this flood? For the first time since Thomas had met her, Valerie seemed speechless. A county inspector's truck pulled in behind Valerie's SUV. A man in a yellow jacket got out, clipboard in hand. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Inspector Clark. We're following up on all the affected properties from last night's flooding. Mind if I have a look at your water management system? We've had some concerns raised. Not at all, Thomas said, handing him the folder of permits. Everything's in order, but I'm happy to show you around. The inspector looked through the paperwork, nodding. These all seem correct. He looked up at the water plant visible in the distance. That facility, however, we've found some irregularities in their flood control systems. Valerie's face paled. 3 months later, Thomas sat with Jenny on his back porch. The water plant was being dismantled, piece by piece. The workers were careful not to damage the land more than necessary, part of the settlement agreement that Jenny had helped negotiate. How's the restoration plan coming? She asked, sipping her lemonade. Thomas smiled. The pond should be back to its original size by next spring. The county's making them replant all the trees they cut down to. In the end, facing massive fines from the county and a class action lawsuit from flooded homeowners, the HOA had surrendered. The water plant would be rebuilt on actual HOA land, with proper permits and flood controls. Thomas would receive substantial compensation for the unauthorized use of his property. And Valerie? After a special election, she was no longer HOA president. Her water-damaged house had it for sale sign out front, and rumor had it she was moving to a condo in the city. You know, Jenny said, you could have just let it go. Thomas watched a pair of ducks land on his pond, smaller now, but healing a little more each day. Some things are worth fighting for, he said quietly. This land is one of them.